welcome to Science Gallery Rotterdam. My name is William Myers. I'm the curator of the first exhibition here at Erasmus MC called Unreal, exploring the terrain between that which is actual and what we perceive and how artists react to it. I'm joined this morning by Bas van Rijn. He is a clinician and research scientist here at the University Hospital, and we'll talk about the exhibition, art-science collaborations, and some of the particular works that are in this show, among other topics. Welcome, Bas.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
To begin, maybe we can start with something we talked about before, an area of your research on which focuses on organoids. How would you explain that to someone who has maybe not unfamiliar with medical science?
Yes, thank you. So we run a research program on trying to recreate specific cells and organs of the human body, and in my case that is focused on the organ called the placenta. So the placenta is the organ developed by the unborn child, so the fetus, which is the organ which makes contact with the mother and supplies the baby with nutrients, with oxygen, and actually acts as a life dependency organ and stimulates growth and development. And in our clinical practice, I see a lot of pregnant women who are carrying a baby with slow fetal growth or with problems related to the placenta that influence development of growth of the baby, and that is a major problem. There are many children born too early or too small because of poorly functioning placenta. And what we like to do at Erasmus is to try to recreate that placenta outside the human body and use the cells within the placenta to grow a new miniature version of your own placenta during the pregnancy, which can allow us in future times to test drugs or other therapies in a safe way. So testing them first on the copy of your placenta outside your body before we try to test these types of therapies in an actual human pregnancy. And we think that idea could change the game of designing treatments for slow growth of babies before birth and preventing pregnancy complications.
So it's like a part of the self outside, like an avatar organ that you can test and learn from.
Absolutely. So this idea, this concept of the miniature growth of organs was first developed around cancer cells and also bowel cells. So basically where doctors take a small part or small specimen of the bowel and then try to grow a new fully functioning unit of that bowel within the lab. And we worked a couple of years ago with some groups to try to see if we could recreate that also for this problem in pregnancy for placenta. So it's an idea that's been around for the last decade or so, but it's only the last year and only this year at Erasmus that we were able to do that for the placenta as well.
Well, coming from it from the perspective of understanding a bit how artists think, I'd imagine that many of them would learn about this or hear just what you said and begin immediately envisioning futures where entire babies can be grown outside the body, or scenarios like this. Have you seen that kind of like artistic representation, and like what do you think of that?
Yeah, so I was of course very much intrigued by the science gallery work, particularly the work of Charlotte Jarvis, whose work emphasizes the idea of recreating your own human body and using actual cells as a substance to create an art project and to bring across certain concepts and ideas about how the future might look like. Mm-hmm. Another example of this type of thinking would be The Matrix, the film The Matrix that a lot of people know, sure, which is probably also based on science fiction books like 1984, Brave New World, where the authors have envisioned a world where there would be an illustration of what would happen when a dictator or someone with not so great intent would actually endeavor on creating a whole society of laboratory grown babies. I don't think that's the direction we wish to go, but I think the artistry from film, from books, from artworks like Charlotte Jarvis have really shown us that we need to use our imagination well for thinking about future applications of this type of technology, and also the boundaries and the concepts. On the other hand, I think it's very positive how artworks tell us, give us good information about the possibilities, and also the positive side of the possibilities of new biotechnologies. And I think artists, by definition, being a creative mindset, having a creative mindset, are able to explain to us a lot of concepts and help us create concepts for solving actual medical and scientific problems.
I imagine also that one of the values of getting this like feedback through their creative work from artists is that artists they seem to have this special ability, this like very sensitive antenna for like understanding how the public feels about things, or like what futures are on the corner. So for example, there's another artist named Annie Liu who does some projects that have to do with imagining a future where gestation can happen outside the body, but it's all about social justice and about like trying to rebalance male-female roles, or strike better balance between responsibilities.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the reality is that that a lot of these changes have actually happened in the actual medical and biomedical field as well. So the art world, of course, has unlimited imagination and tries to cross boundaries that in the real world we think through more and try to connect with the society more before we dare to take such steps. But the technologies are there, and without actually noticing it, a lot of these boundaries have already been crossed in the past years, such as IVF as an example. So in the sort of taking the conception, the actual merging of a sperm cell and an egg cell in a laboratory environment. I think a lot of people tend to forget that the first IVF baby was no longer than 30 or 40 years ago, and that now almost 10 million children are born with that technique. And I think if you think back at those times, it's good to know that the group that started working on IVF in and around Cambridge in the UK, that basically the university was very reluctant to accept the whole idea and said, well, you're crossing certain ethical boundaries that we don't think are a good idea. And eventually IVF ended up in a privately funded institution next to the university.
Okay. And so it is with, like, as you said about IVF, I wasn't really around when that was first coming out, but I can picture, or I think I've learned about people talking about it as this was unnatural, this is a sin against God, or like all these things that are now just, because it works so well and it's benefited so many people, it's really just mainstream accepted practice.
Exactly, and I think there's an element of fear of the unknown, and that when artists or science or both are able to explain more about the actual benefits of a project, about the risks of new technology, that the unknown becomes known, and then that is a good way of creating acceptance. And I think so the way we think about it in the previous years is very simple. There's really no good argument to stop the technology from moving forward. The biotechnology will happen. It's a bit like the computer technology that happened from Silicon Valley in the 1960s onwards, 1980s, 90s in a huge exponential way. What we're now seeing is that biotechnology will probably do the same during this decade and the next 10, 20 years. So that will change the game for a lot of questions. So the technology will happen.
I quite agree with your prediction. I do think that there's, there maybe is some valid disagreement with the technology being inevitably sort of unleashed. So with digital tech, for computerization, for sure that happened, but then it created lots of unintended consequences, right? The concentration of power in just a few companies, loss of privacy, maybe increased wealth inequality. And those that started the digital revolution didn't really intend for that, but this is what we were seeing happen. And I wonder about biotechnology. As it ramps up, as synthetic biology and these sort of other practices really take off, will there also be unintended consequences? Or is there anything we can do to mitigate them?
Yeah, I think the starting point is different. The technology from the ICT perspective immediately has been the game of companies and also was very profitable. And I think the role of academia and the scientist community, that is very different in the health technologies, where we are very aware of that this concerns human life and the human body and integrity and a lot of things we want to think very carefully about. But there are technologies out there like gene editing, or the organoid technology we talked about earlier, that do really require that kind of caution and thinking it through very carefully before we start using it for all sorts of stories. And I think a good example was a few years ago, the technology was found to change human egg cells and sperm cells and change early embryos basically by replacing a gene. And that's something we long thought would not be possible, and also we thought as a community that we found that impermissible, just found that unacceptable. Because you change the course of genetic flow, you change your offspring indefinitely and your children after your children. So we thought about this very carefully. So when the technology came available, so that's the CRISPR-Cas9 technology, immediately a group of scientists and people from different angles started to draw out plans to make sure that the technology is used well. The way I like to look at it is a bit similar to having nuclear energy and having nuclear bombs. So basically, nuclear energy and nuclear bombs are based on the same technology, splitting atoms. And we do, of course that landscape is changing and we have all sorts of concerns and we keep having them, but we've at some point in time found nuclear energy quite acceptable. But immediately thought, well, nuclear bombs is probably best if not everyone in the world has access to nuclear bombs, because that might be very tricky and very dangerous. And I think with biotechnology, this trajectory will have learned from other fields, and we are. My prediction is we are going to be very careful in applying it. And in the end, society will determine what will be the boundaries of what we're doing. And
great. And something that I'm remembering from your presentation last year, you talked about the human placenta, which you explained at the top, and how it's quite unique. Where most of the time when people talk about humans and different species, we say, well, the human brain is so complex and unusual, and it's really what makes us human. But few people know about this. There are some unique qualities of the human placenta that really make it stand apart.
Yeah, that's correct, and it's a very good point. And I usually add to that there's also this odd behavior that we have, that after the baby's born, that we, about 90% of the time, we chuck away the placenta. So we don't learn a lot from the placenta unless you have people like us who are really dedicated on looking at placentas. But you're right, the placenta is very unique to humans and very complex organ that probably in evolution has developed along the same lines as the brain and other complex systems. And it's quite likely that the placenta was needed during the course of evolution to allow for this complex development of human organs such as the brain. There are actually some concrete scientific studies who show that, for instance, the genetic code in the placenta and the way it's regulated, so genes are regulated with a lot of proteins onto the gene code, that make sure which areas are highlighted or used more and used less. And that sort of tweaking of the genetic code, if you look, there are now techniques to try to examine that. And one striking feature of the placenta is that those genetic code tweaks are very similar to brain tissue. So in a way, probably the placenta replaces part of the function of a lot of organs and also is involved in the development. And that's why probably placentas are very different from species to species, and even up to the primates or the ape, certain types of apes, they still have a very different placenta, whereas they have quite a similar heart or quite a similar bone structure. So placenta in that fashion is an organ that we can learn a lot from. And well, so some of my colleagues likes to call this the most neglected organ we have. And I firmly believe that we should, or we could learn a lot more from the placenta, especially in pregnancies where the outcome of pregnancy wasn't so great, or the baby wasn't born as healthy and didn't have a good start, as we would like children to be born.
What's remarkable, like, as you describe it, it's as if the combination of the uterus and the placenta are together this super complex and precise 3D printing system that can construct something as if putting together a city with all the human complexity in a body.
Yeah, that's right. Also, a unique human aspect of the placenta, human placenta, is that the placenta actually invades into the mother. So that doesn't happen in most animal species. So the placental cells, which are basically cells of the baby, some of these groups, they basically separate out from the placenta and go walk about and migrate into the wall of the uterus. And that is something that we do not see in other species. So the mother connects with her baby before birth in a much more intimate fashion than most other species. And it's now been proven also that these placental cells stay within the mother for probably the rest of a human life. And so you could justly say that when you've had a baby together, that you share a bit of yourself through the placental cells between two partners. Wow. And we're not sure, it's a small population of cells, you're not really sure what the role or function of those cells is yet. But you're right, it's a very delicate and intricate interplay between the baby and the mother. So that interface is probably where a lot of early life happens, and we're now more and more thinking that those interactions determine a lot of outcomes and also are predictive of a lot of health outcomes later in life, and that your development of a lot of systems might depend on how good that works out in very early life. So this is another plea, and of course coming from Erasmus MC, which is a hospital that has a life course perspective, this sort of emphasizes that life before birth might hold a lot of clues for a life after birth, and that we need to study placentas and also pregnancies in that perspective.
Great, a bit of a switch of topic. Have you heard your colleagues talk about the Science Gallery installation, their reactions to it, or maybe questions they had for you since you had participated in a workshop?
Yeah, so yes, I have. I think the Science Gallery installation, despite the COVID time and the restrictions we have, that the display works out very well. It's in a somewhat less busy space, so it's easily accessible, and you can view it very well. And I've spoken to a few colleagues who found the artworks very fascinating and provocative, and also very much like the whole concept of being on the border of real and unreal. Also, I think it was very helpful to have an online exhibition. I have been in the habit of inviting all new guests that I had an appointment with, either online or offline, to have a look at the Science Gallery. I got very positive responses. I think the installations illustrate how the topic of health is a very fruitful, imaginative platform for creative ideas, and I think that worked out really, really well.
And any thoughts or ideas about future Science Gallery activity, maybe workshops or other types of programming you can see yourself being a part of?
Yes, of course. I think connecting with society or with is one of the great benefits of projects such as these. I very much like the idea of also taking this type of work into the education arena, so schools, young interested people who still need to learn about both science and both arts and try to get engaged into this kind of thinking, have a whole life ahead of them. I very much like the work of Roberta Trotta, who's a physics professor in London, in UCL. And he did a project which called the Hands-on Universe. So basically he went to secondary schools. He's an astrophysicist, so he has the complicated Einstein questions, which basically, at least I don't understand 90% of those. They're very difficult to grasp, so all about black holes and dark matter. And he takes that complex thinking to secondary schools with artists to try to explain to young students and pupils what the important questions are in astrophysics and how scientists go about to solve them, how artists can represent this and translate that to simple language and tangible concepts. I think that is something which I would really like to do with science and art as well, and I think Science Gallery might be a good stepping stone for such a project.
Well put. Thank you, Bas, for your time and for all your thoughts.
And I'd like to thank you for the interview. Thank you so much for having me.